To hear.
Well, it's lovely to be able to put a face to the name, Tim. We're delighted to have you with us. Tim's an experienced coach. He's got 15 years experience of being involved in fresh expressions of church. And he kind of lives to create, among other things, to create spaces where people, individuals and organizations can reflect on their practice and begin to reorientate themselves to move forward and become all that God is calling them to be in our contemporary situation today. So we're delighted that Tim's been willing to invest his time in preparing for today and in being with us. So thank you very much, Tim. I'm going to hand over to you. And I'm sure our friends, if they want to welcome you with a virtual hand clap, there is a kind of little icon-y thing somewhere, we'll be very happy to do that. So over to you, Tim. Thank you very much.
Alistair, thank you very much indeed for your welcome. It is good to meet you just face to face. Folks might want to hold off their clapping until they've heard what it is that I'm about to share. So it's a delight to be with you this morning. Thank you for being here. And I was struck by just when Carl sent through the publicity, the particular picture that he had chosen. With the bee and that flower and the pollination that was going on there. And I found that really interesting. I've got an allotment myself, and so spend quite a lot of time engaging with my feet firmly planted on the earth and then my hands usually in the soil. And it was a really interesting kind of picture. So as I'm going to just share my screen as we kind of go through. So you should be able to see that. That's the picture that you will have seen from the publicity, a stunning picture. So who am I? So I run my own company called Caris Consultants. My main client is Fresh Expressions here in the UK. So I lead on networking and facilitation across the kind of the network that is Fresh Expressions, and I've been doing that for 3 years. And I also do some work amongst a number of other organisations, Messy Church, Lichfield Diocese, and I do quite a lot of coaching of pioneers. So I've been working on that over the past couple of years and really enjoyed that. I found it a really helpful thing to actually do. I'm a practitioner. I can't help but do this. So I led a Fresh Expression of Church for 11 years in a Methodist setting. I was involved in planting churches in the 1990s with the Church of England and with some Baptist friends. And today I'm part of just a small community of people, Christians and non-Christians, who are exploring what it means to follow Jesus in the 21st century. And actually we had curry last night with a couple of our friends who are in that group, and some really interesting conversations about how they view life and coming out of COVID and some of the things that that they're going through at the moment. And it's just really lovely just to spend time with people exploring what discipleship might look like in those contexts. I'm married to Claire. We have 2 sons, Jack and Daniel, fondly known as the Whiskey Boys. And we have a Springer Spaniel who keeps us lively and walking. He's 11 years old, so he's beginning to get a little bit arthritic, but he's usually ready first thing in the morning to go out for a walk. So that's just a little bit about me. I came across, as I was preparing for this talk today, I came across this quote, which I just absolutely love. The universe is made of stories, not of atoms. And if you like, as we kind of go through part of what we're going to be talking about today, I want to keep coming back to the power of story and how each one of us has a story and how each one of us can tell that story. I'm reminded of the Genesis story, and we read that God was walking in the garden after the fall. And we might consider that might have been the first pandemic. and he utters those immortal words, which I think echo throughout the whole of time. Where are you? And I want that to be the question that we start with today. Where are you? So I'm going to get Carl just to do a couple of simple polls, and there are two questions. The first poll, the first question is, are you hopeful or fearful about the future? So if I take off stop sharing, here we go, brilliant. So if you could just answer that, you can tick one of those, and off you go. Love watching these as people participate. Okay. Nearly all of us have answered. Okay, so approximately it's 9 or 10 to 1, isn't it, in terms of people who are hopeful. And I wonder, what is it that makes you hopeful about the future? Is it your security in Christ? What is it that makes you hopeful about that future? And for those of us who are perhaps just worried, fearful, it might be due to our own personal circumstances. It might be for a whole variety of reasons. But what is it that might make us fearful about the future? If you want to take that poll off, that will be great. Thanks, Cole. And then the second question is about, what are the biggest challenges you face? In the contexts of which you are in, the communities of which you are a part, the people that you are serving in your church context or in your community context, what are the biggest challenges you face? And I just ask you, you can just write the answers straight into this in terms of this poll. I'd be really interested. Doesn't need to be a long answer. What are the biggest challenges you face? Great, we just give it another 20 seconds for those answers to come in. And then, Carl, if you're able to show us what those answers are, that would be brilliant. for your work behind the scenes. Are you able to share those results, Carl?
I think I'm trying to share them at the moment.
Okay, that's fine. That's okay. Thank you.
If it's not coming up on people's screen, it's not coming up on my screen either.
Okay.
But I'll keep attempting to. Apologies. Okay.
Okay, if let's move on, and we can perhaps come back to those when we've got them. Maybe if you get them, Carl, you can paste them into the chat, and then we can have a look at them. That'll be great. Thanks. So I want to just look at 4 themes or overarching themes in terms of where we go this morning. If you like, these are some reflections that have come from my own kind of journey over the last 15 years, my involvement with Fresh Expressions, but also my involvement with rural ministries. So I'm a trustee with rural ministries, and we've been having a couple of projects. One of them in particular, we've got some missional listeners, of which Sarah and Barney Barron are part of that team. And they've been doing some really interesting stuff, and you may well have heard some of the work that they've been doing. So we're just going to concentrate on these 4 overarching themes, and then we're going to explore, if you like, what I think are probably 8 kind of values in terms of our discipleship and what it means to work out our discipleship today. So the first one is from church questions to God questions, or Jesus questions. And if you like, certainly within Fresh Expressions, I think we've fallen into this trap. We've spent too much time talking about church and not enough time talking about Jesus. We've been too ecclesiocentric and not enough Jesus-centric. And too often, sadly, the way that we do church is off-putting to people. And those lovely people at Hope Together and the EA have just published an update about the research that they've done about talking Jesus. It was launched earlier on this week. And when the full report comes out in a couple of weeks' time, please do go and have a read of it, because actually it's crystal clear. People are really interested in Jesus. And too often, our ecclesiology, the way that we do church, gets in the way of how we do mission. Those who, some of our cousins in the Anglican Church will know the responsibility of looking after a listed building and what that means. The way we do church is off-putting to people. Jesus defines our purpose and our methodology. Alan Hirsch talks about in Forgotten Ways. And Alan Roxburgh, who some of you might have come across, but I've been really enjoying some of his reading, and it's crystallized some of my own kind of thinking. It's time that we lay down the questions about how to fix church, or how for it to be more effective, into something like, how do we discern what God is doing ahead of us? God is at work in the world, and dare we join in and leave where it is that we are. And right back in 2004, when Mission Shaped Church report was published, Graham Prey and the team who wrote that commented that start with church and the mission will probably get lost. Start with mission and it is likely that the church will be found. So how do we move from questions which are largely based around church questions to questions which are about God or about Jesus? This beautiful picture. And as I said earlier on, when I first saw this, I thought, oh, wow, that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that picture. But I want to say that small is beautiful. It goes back to the quote that I used right at the very beginning, that actually the world is made up of stories and not of atoms. The world is made up of small things. And if you are anyway interested in the science behind how it is that things are made up, it's really quite interesting. It's actually, there's an awful lot of it, which is space in between the atoms, but that's another story. But this whole thing about the whole world being made up not, and if we like, we approach it in a modern way, in a scientific worldview, the world is made of atoms. And actually, no, it's not. It's made up of stories and how people interact with those stories. And we're called to live as part of the Jesus story, an alternative narrative, the kingdom narrative. And what I'm struck by is how often Jesus talks about smallness. And I just think sometimes that actually it's the world that says the big is better. And I actually want to completely and utterly affirm that small is beautiful. And that the stories which we read, the stories about yeast, about the mustard seed, about the hairs on our head, about the least of these, all those narratives, all those stories which Jesus uses and talks about, and the parables which he interacts with, they're about smallness. And sometimes, you know, in the world in which we live and the way in which we can interact with people, the small things can make a big difference. The saying thank you to somebody in a shop for serving you is a small thing. And yet actually to that person, it can make a tremendous difference in their day, treating them as a human being. I was walking Marley out the other day, and I came across a boy in the middle of the road who had fallen off his bike. And I stopped and I tied Marley up and I looked after him and I took care of him. He got his mobile phone on him and he rang his mum, and his mum came out. He rang his dad and his mum came out and looked after him eventually. And another lady stopped and she was a nurse. And it was a very small, simple act. And yet, as we chatted to that boy, all he kept saying was, thank you for stopping. Thank you for stopping. Thank you for looking after me and taking care of me. So small is beautiful, and don't ever forget it. And then I want to talk about, and I want to challenge, I think, probably about agency and activism. The stunning thing is God is at the center and God is in control. And too often, I think we forget that. I really love using that Luke 10 passage as a way of putting God at the center of what it is that we are doing. I know that it seems obvious, but often in the way that we act and the way that we engage and the way that we manage or try to control things, it seems as though sometimes our own agency, our own actions are at the center. And what does it mean for us to take our hands off the steering wheel and stop managing and strategizing and controlling and to let go and to believe that the God Almighty, the creator of heaven and universe, has got this? And that we in so many ways don't need to be an anxious presence, We can be a non-anxious presence because of what it is that God has done and continues to do. And again, it comes back to this kind of picture about the work of God is larger than the mission of the church. The work of God is larger than the mission of the church, although the church, don't get me wrong, is directly involved in the reign of God. And this is about the partnership, but God is the senior partner. We're not. And I think too often we just kind of forget that. And we misunderstand what that means and how it works its way out. And I think in our language, we just sometimes need to stop and to think. And we can do it during our meetings, during our conversations. Is God at the center of this conversation, of this activity, of this, what it is that we're doing? And I think sometimes this agency that we're in charge, that we need to do it all, you can see it work its way out. How many of us practice Sabbath? That is one of the most fundamental things, and as a command. And yet, actually, in reality, how many of us practice what that means? Walter Brueggemann is crystal clear, an Old Testament theologian, but actually one of the most profound evangelistic things that we might do today is practice Sabbath. That's full of mystery. How does that work? I've no idea, but I find it really interesting. And it's back to this fact that the agency is God's. God is in charge. And actually that regular practice of stopping and of realizing that the world will still keep turning if we are not active in it. And there's something profound about working that out. And I do think sometimes it means we have to stop. During the first pandemic, the first lockdown in March to May 2020, listening to pioneers and having conversations with them, it became very, very clear that most of them felt completely and utterly naked because they actually couldn't do stuff. And what they were discovering was, as they journeyed and as they went through that period, because things went into lockdown and they weren't able to do the activity, they were discovering and beginning to understand that actually maybe God was saying something to them about their own journey and about their own spirituality and their own walk with God, and about putting God back at the center of their lives as opposed to themselves being at the center. And then the fourth picture I want to just talk about is moving from Model T Fords to meadows. Okay, Model T Ford, you can have it in any colour you like as long as it's black. This is the world of modernism. This is the world where we put something in one end and something comes out the other and we know what it is. Church is in urgent need of renewal, and it's going to be a rewilding process. It's not going to so much be about looking at these and the production line of what it is that church might look like. You can have it in any colour as long as it's Baptist. You can have it in any way that you like as long as it's messy. Too often, church is nice and formal, and too often I think the comments have been made, haven't they, about it? Too often it's a waiting room. Whereas actually, I think that the picture of it being a wild meadow is far more helpful. Of things that are listening, that you are able to listen to the context. listen to the context, to understand the local soil, to understand and to live in the local community, and the way that the sun falls on the ground, and that some parts of that ground are drier and won't grow particular crops, and other parts are wetter and will grow particular crops. It's about a deep embedding and a deep engaging in our local communities, to be able to hear what it is that's going on, to be able to see that the wildness of a dandelion and the beauty that it represents springing up between the cracks in the pavement is actually the work of God. And where do we see it? And how do we join in with that activity? What is indigenous to this context in terms of flowers and in terms of vegetables and in terms of what it is that we might grow here? Who are the prophets in this context? Are the dandelions the prophets? It's a question I've often asked myself on the allotment. And really what I want to do is to dig them out and to remove them because they're in the wrong place. And yet actually God seems to be saying something else. God seems to be saying, actually, Tim, is that representative of the person of peace? What is it that grows there? So those are, if you like, 4 overarching themes. Moving from church-shaped questions to God-shaped questions. The commitment, and the actual fundamental belief that small is beautiful and that it is individual stories and the way that that's the way that the world works. About agency and activism, that actually God is at the center of all of this activity. And that sometimes that activity does need to stop. And then the whole idea about moving from Model T forward to meadows, and the picture that holds and the picture that creates for our own minds and what it is that might look like. So what does this mean? So I'm actually going to stop for a moment, actually. I'm going to stop right now and just, I can't see the chat at the moment, so if I can escape and just shut that down. And I'm going to stop sharing so that we can read the brilliant. Thanks putting the feedback in. That's really helpful. That's great. Thank you, Carl, for doing that. And just to let you know, I produced a PDF of all of the slides. Carl has that, and he will be able to use that and send that out to you. So if you have been taking note, that's great, because I know sometimes that's what people need to do. But also, just sometimes having those and being able to go back to them is sometimes really helpful. So what we're going to just do now is go back into what does discipleship look like in this landscape? Okay, what is it that we need to be? How do we need to be in this place and in these contexts? So the first thing I think is about calling, and a posh word called kenosis, which is about self-emptying. And I think it goes back to some of the pictures about being centered on God and what that works out like and what that means. And actually, each one of us is called by God at our baptism to be engaged in the work that God has called us to be, of reconciling the world to himself. And I think too often we forget that. And it's a baptism calling. It's not a minister calling. It's not a deacon calling. It's a baptism calling. And now, if you like, what Elaine Heath, in a brilliant little book called The Mystic Way of Evangelism, talks about, now more than ever, when so many pastors measure their success in numbers, buildings, and budgets, the church is starving for holy leadership. What does holy leadership look like in your context? How do you live? How does each one of us live out our calling? Every member ministry. How do we live out our baptismal calling? And what does it mean to empty ourselves? Not in activism, but before God. to make that journey, which is often a very painful journey of discovering who it is that we really are, and for God to be more in control of our lives. So the first is calling and kenosis. And the second is about discerning. And I can't help but wonder if we spend too much time with our programs and with management, and actually as a consequence of which, we don't need God, because we know where it is that we go and we've got our 5-year plan, and that's how it's going to be. And actually what it does is it disables us and disconnects us from the Almighty. And at this point in time, at this point in history, we need people who are connected deeply and are able to discern the signs of the times and to see what it is that God is doing in our communities. And then to have the guts and the courage to follow that. Not knowing the future is good. I think that's where we are right now. We don't know what the future is going to look like. It is unknown. And when that happens, what happens is freedom and improvisation and innovation begins to happen. And how can we discern the work of God and the activity of God in those processes, the agency of God? The third one is about noticing. And this is about the detail, if you like. We talked about the whole kind of rewilding process of moving from Model T Fords to Meadows. And actually it is about noticing. I love this. I love this. The scriptures make me laugh sometimes. This reading from John 10. Then came the festival of dedication at Jerusalem. It was winter. And Jesus was in the temple courts walking in Solomon's colonnade. Now, I'm sure there are better biblical scholars than me, but I love the fact that John noticed it was winter and he recorded it and he wrote it down. Do we notice what it is that's going on? Do we see, sense, smell what it is that's going on? The Celts have a picture of the Holy Spirit as a wild goose. Oh, I'm on the wrong page. And if you like this, the whole thing about noticing is not a passive activity. You can't notice sitting in an office. You can't notice sitting in home. You have to be out and about in the community. And I think it involves all of our senses. What can you smell that's cooking within your community? What do you observe people doing? You need to be intentional about doing it. And what is, again, is wonderful about this, in this noticing, then actually it's about taking our hands off. It's not about being in control. And then I also think it's about being curious. This is about giving you permission to be nosy. And to kind of go, oh, so what's going on there then? So, it naturally follows from noticing, why is that happening? What's going on there? Curiosity is unruly. It doesn't like rules, or at least it assumes that rules are provisional, subject to the laceration of a smart question nobody has yet asked. And again, it's just this thing about opening things up. It's slightly messy. It's slightly, this makes me feel uncomfortable. But what is it that's going on here? Why is it happening? How do we engage with this? So the fourth one is about practicing the art of curiosity. How many times have you been in a church meeting when you've said, somebody has said something and you said, well, we tried that some time ago and we're not going to try it again? Where is curiosity? How does it get its way out? I do think that discipleship is about co-creating. And that's not just with fellow Christians. You see it in food banks. You see it in council meetings. You see it all over the place in our country right now. Co-creating together is going to be really, really important. Disciples who can work with people from a whole variety of backgrounds and a whole variety of contexts. And what co-creating does is it creates ownership. It moves from I to we. And at that point, the world begins to change, because it's not just you doing this on your own. It's about how can we do this together. So co-creating. And I also think all of these things become really important then, because actually they are all culture changing and culture creating. And fundamentally, that is the change that we need to begin to do. A culture changing in our church communities, in the communities of which we are a part. And then you could argue, I'm bound to say this, I do think that actually coaching leaders or coaching disciples is absolutely crucial. Mentoring will work so far, but when push comes to shove, you're going to need to coach people. Because if you mentor people, you're only mentoring and taking them to the point of your own ability, of your own experience. Whereas coaching takes them to the point where actually they might go beyond that, and they might be contextually working out what it is that something looks like in their place, in their communities, in the work which they are doing, in the pioneering which they are involved with. And this quote, which I love from a couple of Catholic theologians: the history of the Christian movement is nothing if not the history of Christians struggling to be faithful to God's Spirit, as the Spirit is made manifest in new and surprising ways, in new and surprising contexts. If you mentor somebody, you're mentoring them for where it is that you got to and for yesterday. If you coach them, you're coaching them for a future which is not yet known, and to be able to do what Bevins and Schroeder talk about. And the final one, well, I'm just not quite sure about this one, which is why it's got a brackets around it. I wonder if the final one is about tent making. The number of people who I've had conversations with, and this was, it was a Baptist minister, and I talked to quite a lot of people across the whole ecumenical spread. And they said this: I need to leave the church to get on with the mission I think God has called me to. In what world does that make any sense whatsoever? And yet, actually, that was the conversation that we had. And I asked him, what transferable skills do you have? And we had a really interesting conversation then as a result of that. So I'm not quite sure, but I do wonder what tent making has to do in terms of kind of the future and where it is that we're going to next. So calling and kenosis, discerning, noticing, curiosity, co-creating, culture changing, coaching leaders, and tent making. They're nearly all C's, but I couldn't make it for otherwise. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to you, and yeah, ask if there are any comments or any questions that folks want to ask as a result of some of the things that I've talked about this morning.
Do you want those comments audibly, or do you want them written in the chat box?
If you want to put them in the chat box, that will be great. That's fine. But if you want to ask a question, if you want to put your hand up, I can see most of the screen now. So yeah, if you've got any I'm more than willing to answer any questions, or to yeah, if you want to yeah, put your digital hand up in the which comes in the reactions, and yeah, that would be great.
Whilst people are putting questions in, Tim, I wonder whether you want to say a little bit more about that last point you made about the Baptist ministers that felt they needed to leave the church in order to fulfill what God was calling them to do. Totally agree with how strange that might sound, but I suspect it probably is not just that one Baptist minister that's felt that way. I guess my question is what's your advice to someone in that position? Is your advice, so you need to leave then and fulfill what God's called you to do, or is it so you need to stay and continue to work with those who have called you on the mission of God? I know it's not a kind of a yes or no straightforward question,
yeah,
but to tease that out a little bit more.
I do think the pandemic has speeded some things up, and one of them is about people leaving what I would call kind of institutional or organizational church.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know quite what that is about, whether that is a work of the Spirit. But I also think that there is, yeah, there is a real sense sometimes that actually you can't do what it is that God's calling you to because of certain limitations and certain expectations that are placed upon you by people, organizations. And as a consequence of that, then that means something has to change and something has to give.
Yeah.
And if you like, that can be, I think that can be deeply, deeply challenging to that individual and about their ongoing discipleship and walk with God and how that works its way out. But I would say I probably had conversations with 6 to 10 people, some of them church leaders, and more along exactly those lines in the last 18 months.
That's helpful, thank you.
Which is yeah, it's quite scary in a way.
I agree. I've had contact with long-standing church members and of my role, yes, regional ministry. But one used the phrase of church as she'd always known in her life. She'd been in various roles of leadership in the church, and going back after the pandemic, she said it feels like trying to put on an ill-fitting pair of shoes, was the phrase that she used. It's familiar, but they just don't fit anymore. They're not the shoes for the walking in the kingdom of God, I guess was what she...
Phil's asked a question, talk with church about how you and they follow God's call. That's good advice. Yeah, what new model can we grow together? Is that not what we are pioneering? I think it probably is. But again, I would just want to say that for some people it is contextual, and sometimes people still end up feeling too constrained. Some people, though, are all able to have that conversation, which is brilliant, and are then able to work it out, and it becomes that discontent then drives into a new energy for discovering and working out something new. Hillary's posted about a book by a guy called Steve Aisthorpe, who's also talked about a book about rewilding the church. I've actually put that in the notes, so when you get the PDF, you'll see that in the resources section. Steve's research in Scotland about the invisible church is particularly interesting. Thank you, Hilary, for doing that. Are there any other kind of just questions? Oh, Stevie's speaking at a conference. Alistair, yeah, have you got your hand up?
Yeah, Tim, I'm just thinking of your point, agency and activism.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you've got any thoughts. So I'm thinking of those who are maybe more of a traditional, more of an inherited model of church. And noticing, trying to tie in what you were saying about agency and activism, but also the thing about culture, the transformation of culture. I'm just wondering if you've got any comments to make on some kind of process as to how a church might transition from that perceived highly active kind of model to something that's more along the lines of what you were alluding to.
So there, I think Alan Roxburgh's got some really good stuff about this. So he would talk about starting, and I think we've seen this. So and we see this in Fresh Expressions an awful lot, I think, and also through the missional listening, is starting with listening to each other is key, and telling stories is absolutely crucial. And then also using some process that very similar to actually what you used this morning, of engaging with the scriptures and asking some very simple questions around what are we called to, what does that look like? I mean, there's a process for missional church, which comes out of CMS, which uses that Luke 10 passage and uses it for a whole church to spend a whole 2 years dwelling in that passage. And so what it does is it recenters people completely and utterly on the stories of which they're telling each other, because often they are anxious about reaching other people. It centers them in God's word and what it is that God might be saying to them about what it is that might look like next. And you'd be surprised. It seems a ridiculous thing today to say, but actually when a group of people sit together and dwell in the word, the Spirit turns up.
That Partnership for Missional Church, is that what you're talking?
Yeah.
In the West, we did the UK pilot of that about 13, 14 years ago with Church Innovations from the States.
Yeah.
And our reimagine process that we have in the West is
brilliant.
In many respects kind of slightly based on that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that actually there's some really key stuff about that. And then the third thing I would say is get out there and listen and notice and observe and do some of those things which I've talked about. And you can do that when you walk to the shop, when, I do it when I go down to the allotment all the time. I'm engaging with people. People come and tell me stuff, which I'm only the second person they ever tell. What's going on there? What is that a sign of within our community? That's my curiosity question coming out.
Thank you. There's a challenge there for us then, isn't it? Because if we've got people who are very busy and active in the life of the church, running all sorts of activities, that reduces our capacity to be in the community, doesn't it? And to be God's ambassadors of hope in the community, I think is LICC.
Yeah. And it feels like there's kind of a whole almost turning inside out.
To do within the ones,
Sorry. Sorry, you interrupted then. Something I was going to say, there's a sense of urgency we often hear in the church, and often this verse about sending people out, we've used as a mission statement. The workers are few, we've got to send people out, let's go and do a mission and do things. But what you're saying, and I agree with you, is slow down, stop, look, find where God is. Let's do things a bit slower and in more realistic terms. There's an activism that is about being with people and building those relationships. And I think we've got the wrong activism in the church very often, which is about do and bring in, the, what's it called? Attractional model.
Attractional model, yes.
Yeah. I was at a Bible study on Thursday where we looked at this passage, and somebody brought up the story of Paul coming out at Troas and going out of the walls and meeting Lydia outside. And they were saying they've changed what they do normally. Paul normally goes into the synagogue and talks to people, but he didn't do that in Troas. He went out. And we noticed that Luke had turned up and joined them by the change in there. And Luke might have been writing this very passage from Luke 10 at the time and saying, hang on a minute, you've got this all wrong. You've got to go out and talk to people because that's what Jesus said. So this might be a sea change in the church then, the early church, to get out and do it as Jesus said, rather than just hang around in the places expecting them to go to the religious places. So we can do sea changes, we can make differences, and we can do it right if we let the Bible dwell in us a bit and let this word change us.
Thank you, Phil.
Any other questions for Tim or comments that people want to make? We'll move on in a minute or two to kind of the next section of this morning, but I want to give opportunity if there's anyone that has anything they want to comment or question for Tim. Everyone's very quiet. Tim, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm sure people want to show appreciation either on the screen or in the chat box or with claps. I see there's a few claps already. Please do. It's been a blessing, my friend, and we are so grateful to you for what you shared today.